In 1692, a wave of fear-mongering, false trials and executions swept through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Wives, nieces, aunts, daughters, and sisters were brought to be burnt at the stake. What caused the quiet town to break into an all-out panic? Could witches be real? Or could something else explain the magnitude of the panic? In this episode, we will be taking a look at what actually happened during the Salem witch trials. January 1692, where it all began. The Paris household was hosting a sleepover for Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail. As the cold frost of the season waged war outside, the two enjoyed playing together before it was time to go to bed. In the past few weeks, the pair had become enamored with fortune-telling and, according to some sources, had dropped egg whites into a glass of water in order to see their future. When the egg white turned into the shape of a coffin, the pair vowed never to dabble in the practice ever again. However, the entities they had called forth to bring them their fortunes weren't quite done with them just yet. That night as they slept, Betty's father, Reverend Paris, went to check on the girls and was horrified to see them contorting into different shapes, speaking a language they didn't know, and thrashing around as they slept. Reverend Paris had noticed strange behavior in the pair in the last few weeks, from forgetting simple errands, missing church, to appearing with cuts and bruises in places they couldn't possibly reach. He called a doctor, and they both reached the same conclusion. They were bewitched. Betty and Abigail claimed that a woman named Tituba, a Native American slave who served in the Paris home, was responsible for what had been done to them. It's well known that Tituba participated in fortune-telling games, which the Puritans of the town categorically forbade. The pair also accused homeless beggar Sarah Good and elderly Sarah Osborne for bewitching them. The town began gossiping, refusing to take Reverend Paris's services, and instructing their children to stay away from the girls. In an attempt to shield Betty and Abigail from harm, he sent them to live with a cousin in the next town over. But that didn't stop the rumors. With the girls gone, they each found someone new to focus on, insisting that witchcraft was among them, and going to extreme lengths to stem the spread. The doctor who had diagnosed Betty and Abigail as being bewitched diagnosed other girls living close by with the same affliction, claiming that Tituba, Sarah Good, and Osborne had cursed them too. The three women were rounded up and thrown into jail awaiting trial. The three alleged witches were hauled before the magistrates and interrogated, as their accusers made an impressive courtroom appearance while writhing, shouting, and having convulsions. Good and Osborne denied being guilty, but Tituba admitted it. She claimed that other witches were working with her in the devil's army against the Puritans, feeding into the town's desire for vengeance. Tituba's admission started a catalyst of hate, mainly towards women. Husbands would tire of their wives and simply call them a witch in order to be rid of them. Sisters turned on sisters, and anyone acting odd in any way, shape, or form were rounded up. The situation inside the dungeons where they were held was terrible. It was gloomy, bug and rat infested, cold in the winter, and sweltering in the summer, and had only a dirt floor. Prisoners in chains. Up to the prisoners' ankles would be submerged in water. It smelled like death and feces. The tiny cells lacked both bedding and cell bars. Prisoners had to pay for their food in straw bedding, and if they couldn't afford it, they went without. If they were unable to pay, they were kept in coffin-like, phone booth-sized cages where they could only stand. In addition, they had to pay for the expense of the test to check for witch marks, as well as the cuffs, chains, and fetters they had to wear. When spectral evidence, such as dreams or visions, maleficium evidence, and the existence of the witch's mole were present, the accused stood no chance. Maleficium proof, for example, when two women would argue, and one would say, "You'll regret this later," only for her child to fall sick the next day, meaning the person who said the threat had cursed her. Several alleged witches confessed and named additional defendants, and the trials quickly overflowed the local legal system. A separate court system was set up, specifically for those with trials in May 1692. The court handed down its first conviction against Bridget Bishop on June 2nd. She was executed 8 days later on what would become known as Gallows Hill in Salem town. That July, 5 more were executed by hanging, 5 more in August, and 8 more in September. There may have been 150 people in the Salem dungeon at one point. Dorcus Good, 4, was the youngest girl accused of witchcraft and sent to jail. She was incarcerated alongside her mother, Sarah Good, who had been accused by Betty and Abigail. In February 1692, Sarah was tried, found guilty, and given the death penalty. At that time, however, she was expecting, and her execution was postponed. If an accused witch denied her guilt, he or she would be subject to one of a series of tests made in order to determine if they were a witch or not. 1. The accused would verbally command the devil to leave the victim who was suffering in the incantation test. If the victim recovered, the accuser's witchcraft was established. 2. The accused were required to recite the Lord's Prayer or a passage of scripture from memory during the prayer test. They were a witch if they made a mistake. 3. The accused were scraped and pricked by their alleged victims until they began to bleed. If the victim's ailments were cured, that was evidence that the accused was a witch. 4. Moles, freckles, birthmarks, scars, and additional nipples were all indicators that someone had made a pact with the devil, according to the skin test. 5. Accused witches were chained at the wrist and ankles and lowered into a body of water for the swimming test, also known as dunking. They had committed witchcraft if they floated. They were innocent if they went down, but often drowned anyway. 6. The suspected witch would allegedly touch her victims. The witch was shown to be guilty if the victims experienced pain. 7. Witches were allegedly exceedingly light. Thus, judges attempted to weigh them against the Bible's weight. The court merely conducted another test to determine the accused's guilt when they weighed more than the book. 8. A dog would allegedly experience negative consequences if the witch created a cake with her urine and fed it to it. Those deemed guilty, if they hadn't died during the test, would be hung, beheaded, or burned at the stake. No matter the deaths, their bodies would usually be burnt, with the Puritans believing diminishing them to ashes meant they couldn't curse them after death. The families of those killed were then ordered to pay more money for the inconvenience of killing their loved ones. Giles Corey, a prosperous farmer who was born in Northampton, England, in 1621, would later come to symbolize the conclusion of the Salem witch trials. Corey traveled to America for 3 months sometime after his first marriage to Margaret. He initially made his home in Salem town, where the couple had a daughter, before relocating to Salem Village to start a farm. Margaret, however, passed away soon after starting a farm. In 1664, Corey wed Mary Bright once more. For the following 12 years, the two made a pleasant living farming and attending church. In 1675, Jacob Goodell, Corey's farmhand, was caught stealing apples from his storage place. Corey beat his farmhand to death with a stick out of rage. Town officials decided on a fee as restitution for Goodell's death, rather than sending this devoted churchgoer to jail. Following the death of his second wife in 1684, Corey wed a third time, this time to Martha Pannon 6 years later. When the Salem witch trials first began to be broadcast, Martha and Corey were among the first members of the town to see them. Martha quickly started to question the veracity of the allegations and forbade her husband from going any longer. However, many people in Salem believed Martha was a witch because she persuaded her husband not to go to the trials. Some of the girls started imitating Martha's motions and actions. As a result, they claimed that the elderly woman was manipulating and bewitching them. On March 21st, 1692, Martha was formally charged of practicing witchcraft and taken into custody. Corey betrayed Martha by giving false testimony against her until he, too, was arrested and accused of witchcraft himself at the age of 81. On April 19, 1692, Giles Corey's trial got underway. Corey steadfastly declined to speak at his trial. Instead, they stripped Corey to his bare skin and made him sit on the ground. A large board was placed on top of him. Large stone weights were then gradually put to the board. This occurred over the course of 2 or 3 days. The moment Corey's body began to be crushed by the stones, he screamed, "More weight! More weight!" until he was crushed to death. After hanging Corey's wife, Martha, to death, on September 22, 1692, the people of Salem would eventually come to their senses. The inhabitants of Salem started to question the efficacy of the witch hunt. Historians deemed Corey a martyr as a result of his horrific demise. A month after the execution of Giles Corey, the new court was disbanded, and those awaiting trial or execution were released. The Salem witch trials were over. Or was it?